The young woman came into Louisa Mercer's millinery shop, carrying a dead woman's voice in a pasteboard box. Rain shone on the shoulders of her brown coat. One glove was split at the thumb, and the damp had loosened a strand of black hair against her cheek. She looked neither poor enough to beg, nor prosperous enough to be welcomed without explanation. She stood between the counter of mourning veils and the mirrored stand where Florence was fitting Mrs. Harcourt's new hat, and asked for Louisa Bell Mercer. Louisa had not heard her maiden name spoken in that room for years. The women near the mirror stopped discussing ostrich feathers. Florence's hands went still above Mrs. Harcourt's silver hair. Even the apprentice at the back table raised her head from a length of buckram. Louisa came out from behind the curtain that separated the workroom from the shop. She was 58, straight-backed, and dressed in grey so exact that people often mistook restraint for calm. She looked first at the stranger's wet hem, then at the box held against her chest. The young woman said her own name was Marian Venn. Her mother had been Anna Bell. For one moment, Louisa saw no shop at all. She saw a narrow upstairs bedroom, a summer dress hanging from a peg, and her younger sister sitting on the floor with pins between her lips. Then the vision closed as quickly as a door. Anna had been dead to the Bell family for 26 years. Louisa said so. Marian did not flinch. She lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nested in yellowed cotton, lay a brown wax cylinder. Its surface was dull, almost soft-looking, and a strip of paper had been fitted into the lid. On it, in a hand Louisa knew before she allowed herself to know it, were 4 words. For my sister, Louisa. Marian explained that Anna had recorded the cylinder shortly before her death. It contained less than 2 minutes of speech. She had wanted Louisa to hear her voice once more. Mrs. Harcourt turned in the fitting chair. The movement made the little black plumes on her unfinished hat tremble. Louisa felt every listening face in the shop. She also felt Florence beside the mirror, young and marriageable, with the Harcourt family considering her as carefully as they would consider a house on which they might lend money. The old story about Anna had thinned over the years, but it had never disappeared. A thief, a runaway, a woman who chose a German cabinet maker and disgrace over her widowed mother and respectable sister. Louisa closed the lid of the box. She told Marian that whatever Anna had wished to say should have been said while she was alive. The shop was not the place for old accusations, and the Bell family had no room for claims made by strangers. Marian's face changed then, though only around the mouth. She said she had brought no claim. She had brought a voice. Louisa answered that she did not want it. It was Florence who whispered, "Aunt Louisa." That small protest made the refusal harder. Louisa took the cylinder from the box, set it on the counter, and pushed the empty box back toward Marian. She meant the gesture to end the matter. Instead, it looked like contempt. Marian put the lid beneath the box and held both under one arm. She did not pick up the cylinder. Before leaving, she said that Anna had waited most of her life for Louisa to ask one question. She had died understanding that the question would never come. Marian had promised to deliver the recording, not to force anyone to listen. Her promise was now kept. Then she walked out into the rain with one glove split at the thumb. No one in the shop spoke until the door shut. Mrs. Harcourt was the first to recover. She studied herself in the mirror and observed that family troubles were best kept inside the family. Because she belonged to a family that owned the town's oldest bank, the sentence sounded less like advice than law. Louisa returned to the fitting as if nothing had happened. She adjusted the hat by 1/2 inch, removed 2 feathers, and replaced them with 1. Her fingers did not shake. Only after Mrs. Harcourt had gone did Florence lift the cylinder from the counter. It was lighter than it looked. That offended Louisa for reasons she could not name. A voice ought to have weight. She told Florence to place it in the cabinet with the other records. The shop kept an Edison phonograph for Saturday afternoons. Customers enjoyed the brass band marches, and young women sometimes stayed to hear sentimental songs while pretending to compare ribbons. Elias had bought the machine in 1901 when he believed every successful establishment should display one modern wonder. He had been dead 3 years now, but the phonograph still occupied a polished table near the front window. Beneath it stood a cabinet with 2 shelves of cylinders in round cardboard cases. Florence asked whether Louisa meant to listen after closing. Louisa said no. She said it too quickly. By 5 o'clock, the rain had turned the street the color of iron. The factory whistle sounded from the east side of Millbrook, and women from the shirtwaist works passed beneath the shop awning in groups, their skirts lifted above the mud. A streetcar clanged at the corner. Louisa watched it without seeing it. Florence put on her cloak. At 23, she had Louisa's dark eyes, but none of Louisa's talent for keeping thought out of her face. She had lived with Louisa since her own parents died of fever 12 years before, and she called her aunt only in company. At home, when frightened or grateful, she sometimes called her Mother Louisa. That evening, she said neither name. She merely asked if the woman was truly Anna's daughter. Louisa extinguished the gas jets one by one. She said people could call themselves anything. Florence looked at the wax cylinder in its cabinet. She remarked that Marion had Anna's eyes. Louisa locked the cabinet and put the key into her reticule. They walked home together beneath one umbrella. Mercer House stood 6 blocks away on Sycamore Street, a square brick house with a narrow porch and white stone lintels. Elias had been proud of those lintels. He used to touch one as he passed, as if the house were a horse he had trained. Louisa had not touched them once since his funeral. At supper, Florence spoke about the spring exhibition of the Ladies' Improvement League. Louisa was chairing the display of women's industries. The millinery shop would provide hats from 3 decades. Mrs. Harcourt would lend a lace wedding veil, and the phonograph would supply music during the reception. Florence had spent a week writing labels in her neat academy hand. Louisa listened, answered where necessary, and cut her chicken into pieces too small to require cutting. On the sideboard lay a cream envelope that had arrived that morning. She had recognized her daughter's hand and left it unopened through breakfast, the day's fittings, Marion's visit, and supper. Florence noticed the envelope. She did not mention it until the maid had cleared the plates. Ruth lived in Cleveland with Samuel Moretti, the son of an Italian stonecutter. 8 years earlier, she had married him without Louisa's blessing. Louisa had called it recklessness. Ruth had called it choosing her own life. Between those 2 descriptions lay 8 years of Christmas cards, 3 returned parcels, and 1 birth announcement that Louisa kept in a locked desk, despite having sent no reply. Florence asked if she might open the letter aloud. Louisa said it was not a letter. She could tell by the stiffness that it was a photograph. That was worse. Florence reached toward it, then withdrew her hand. She said Ruth might not continue sending them forever. Louisa looked at her. The sentence had sounded very much like Marion. She took the envelope upstairs unopened. In her bedroom, she placed it in the second drawer beneath her gloves. The birth announcement was there, along with a small card on which Ruth had written 6 years ago that the baby's name was Grace Louisa Moretti. Louisa had spent a whole night resenting the use of her name, and the following 6 years remembering it. From the street came the rattle of a late carriage. From the room across the hall came Florence's careful steps. The house settled into its familiar silence. Louisa thought of the cylinder in the dark shop cabinet. She did not think of Anna's voice. She thought of the danger of wax near a radiator, of surface dust, of an apprentice's careless hand. Before bed, she wrote a note instructing Florence to pack the phonograph cylinders properly for the exhibition. She slept badly and blamed the rain. The Ladies' Improvement League held its exhibition 2 days later in the assembly room above the county courthouse. The room smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and the lilies arranged beneath a portrait of President McKinley. Along the walls stood examples of work that respectable women were permitted to call industry, as long as no one mentioned wages. Embroidery, preserves, school copybooks, painted china, hospital bandages, hats, and a model of the proposed public drinking fountain. Louisa arrived before 9. She wore black silk and the jet brooch Elias had given her on their 20th anniversary. Her widowhood was no longer fresh enough to require full mourning, but black lent authority, and she expected to need it. Florence and the apprentice had brought the phonograph from the shop in a horse cab. The horn rested on the table like a great brass morning glory. Beside it stood a crate of cylinders, each wrapped in tissue. Louisa checked the labels, corrected the angle of the Harcourt veil, and moved a jar of quince preserves away from the hats. She saw no brown wax cylinder without a case. She felt relief first, then annoyance at herself for feeling it. By 11, the room had filled. Clerks' wives came in their best day dresses. Factory girls climbed the stairs in pairs and became quiet beneath the painted ceiling. 3 newspaper men stood near the door, though only one of them had been invited. Mrs. Harcourt arrived with her son, Edwin, who was being carefully, publicly attentive to Florence. Louisa noticed how Florence colored when he bent to speak to her. She also noticed Mrs. Harcourt noticing. The speeches began. There were remarks about cleanliness, civic pride, and the elevating influence of women. Louisa gave a brief account of the display. She did not enjoy public speaking, but she trusted sentences that had been written the night before. When the applause ended, Florence wound the phonograph. The first cylinder was a Sousa march. Its bright, crowded sound filled the room and made several children laugh. The second was a comic recitation that Louisa disliked but had approved because Mrs. Harcourt found it amusing. During the third selection, Florence was called away to help with the veil. The apprentice, Elsie, chose the next cylinder from the crate. She had wrapped every loose record in tissue, exactly as instructed. She removed the paper, slid the brown cylinder onto the mandrel, and lowered the reproducer. At first, there was only a dry rush, like wind passing over stiff grass. Then, a woman breathed close to the horn. Louisa knew that breath. The room disappeared around her for the second time in 2 days. The recorded woman spoke slowly, as people did when they distrusted the machine. She said Louisa's name, not Mrs. Mercer, not Lou, Louisa, with the soft middle syllable Anna had always drawn out when they were girls. Several heads turned. The voice said there was no longer time for another letter to be returned. It said the money from their mother's cash box had not been taken by Anna. The wax revolved beneath the needle. The voice continued. Elias took it. I kept silent because... Louisa crossed the room and lifted the reproducer so violently that the horn gave a sharp metallic cry. Silence followed. Not true silence. There were skirts moving, someone coughing near the door, wheels grinding on the street below. But every person in the assembly room had become occupied with not looking at Louisa. She stood with one hand on the phonograph and the other at her throat. Across the room, Mrs. Harcourt looked first at Louisa, then at Florence, then at Edwin. The order of those glances told Louisa exactly how far a dead woman's voice could travel. Louisa dismissed the moment as an error in the program. Her voice sounded ordinary. That was the strangest part. She instructed Elsie to play the next cylinder and walked to the hat display, where a blue velvet toque had somehow been placed among the summer straws. She corrected it. She answered a question about the width of a mourning band. She stood beside the county judge's wife while a photographer made an exposure that required everyone to hold still. No one asked who Anna was. No one needed to. Millbrook had fewer than 19,000 people, which was large enough for electric streetlights and 2 daily newspapers, but not large enough for a scandal to lose its name before supper. Older women remembered Harriet Bell standing in the Methodist sewing room in 1881 and declaring that her younger daughter had stolen $600. Younger women knew only that Mrs. Mercer had once had a sister no one mentioned. By noon, those two pieces had been joined to the recorded accusation against Louisa's dead husband. The exhibition continued for 3 more hours. Edwin Harcourt remained near Florence, but his mother found repeated reasons to summon him. When he returned after the 3rd summons, his face was tight. Florence folded hospital bandages at a table meant to demonstrate useful work and did not look up. At 4, after the last visitor left, Louisa removed the cylinder herself. A pale line showed where the needle had traveled. There was also a new gouge near the beginning, made when she had lifted the reproducer sideways. She wrapped the wax in clean cotton and placed it in her reticule. Florence asked if she had damaged it. Louisa said she did not know. "Did Uncle Elias take the money?" Louisa looked toward Elsie, who was packing the hats at the other end of the room. She told Florence that dead people could make accusations without answering questions. Until there was proof, Anna's words were only words. Florence did not argue. She asked a quieter question instead. Why had Louisa refused even to listen in private? Louisa bent over the crate of cylinders. She said the past had been settled long ago. Florence answered that settled things did not usually make a person tear the needle from a machine. It was the first impertinent thing she had said in months. Louisa might have admired it on another day. The horse cab carried them home through a thin, cold mist. Florence sat opposite, with both hands around the handle of her umbrella. They spoke only about the risk of water stains on velvet. At the house, a note from Mrs. Harcourt waited on the salver. The wording was gracious. Edwin's mother regretted that Florence could not join them for Sunday dinner, as there had been a change in family plans. Louisa read the sentence twice. It did not say that the invitation would be renewed. Florence asked whether the change concerned the cylinder. Louisa told her not to invent injuries before they occurred. She said a young woman's composure mattered most when gossip wished to borrow her face. Florence went upstairs without supper. Louisa carried the phonograph into Elias's study. The room had been left largely as he kept it. A walnut desk faced the window. His law books stood behind rippled glass, though he had not practiced law. He had believed a merchant should understand contracts well enough not to pay other men for common sense. His cigar humidor was empty. His green reading shade gathered dust because Louisa never lit the lamp. She set the phonograph on the desk and closed the door. The machine required simple actions. Fit the cylinder, wind the spring, place the reproducer, lower the needle gently. Elias had shown her many times, and she had pretended not to remember because he enjoyed instructing her. Her hands remembered now. She began at the place where the exhibition had ended. The wax turned. Anna's voice returned in a wash of surface noise. She said Elias had taken the money. She had kept silent because Louisa was carrying a child and had already buried one. Elias had promised to tell the truth within a week before suspicion could harden. Anna had believed him because Louisa believed him. The recording paused. Somewhere in the room where Anna had spoken, a chair scraped. Her breathing sounded tired. Then came the sentence that broke through Louisa's anger. Anna said she had written every year for 11 years. Every letter had come back unopened, sometimes with Louisa's name crossed out in Elias's hand. After that, she had written only on Ruth's birthdays. Those letters had also returned. The cylinder hissed and clicked. Anna said she had no wish to take Louisa's husband from her after taking so much else. She had wanted only one answer: whether Louisa knew. If Louisa knew and chose him, Anna would accept it. If Louisa did not know, then silence had become another theft. Her voice weakened at the end. She asked Louisa not to let their daughters inherit it. The last words were almost lost beneath the turning wax. A silence can outlive the reason for it. The needle entered the blank run-out groove. A soft knock repeated with each revolution. Louisa did not lift the reproducer. She listened to the knock until the spring slowed and the machine stopped. She had expected accusation. What she felt instead was recognition, not of the facts, which were impossible, but of Anna's habit of taking breath before a difficult word. The machine had kept that tiny hesitation for her. It had kept the faint roughness that came into Anna's voice after crying, though Anna had plainly meant not to cry. No imposter could have known those things. No daughter repeating a story could have made them. Louisa sat in Elias's chair. In the bottom drawer of the desk was the family checkbook, his last spectacles, and a packet of receipts from the year before his death. She searched it, then the drawer above. She looked behind the law books and beneath the blotter. She found nothing bearing Anna's hand. That should have steadied her. Instead, it made the room feel arranged. Elias had liked order. He had destroyed old correspondence every January, tying bills into bundles and burning personal papers in the study grate. Louisa had considered it prudence. Now she saw how easily prudence could erase a person. She played the cylinder again. The second time, the voice gave her a room she had not noticed before. A clock ticked behind Anna. Children sang faintly beyond a wall, perhaps in a school or mission house. Near the end, a man coughed twice. These details had no argument to make. They simply proved that Anna had occupied a real place, while Louisa had spent 26 years treating her as a moral lesson. At 11, Louisa covered the phonograph with a cloth and went upstairs. Florence's lamp was still burning. A strip of light lay across the hall carpet. Louisa knocked. Florence sat at her dressing table in a white wrapper. In front of her was a prospectus from the Lakeside Training School for Nurses. She tried to cover it with a hairbrush, then stopped. The gesture was so young and so weary that Louisa felt ashamed. For 2 years, Florence had spoken of nursing. Louisa had answered with the hours, the dirt, the impropriety of tending strange men, and the waste of a good academy education. When the Harcourts began inviting Florence to dinner, the discussion ended without either woman declaring it ended. Louisa told her that Anna's voice was genuine. Florence waited. Louisa added that nothing had yet been proven about Elias. Florence asked what proof a living woman would be required to give after Louisa had refused her at the shop door. The question was just. Louisa disliked it for that reason. She said she would go to Cincinnati the next morning and speak with Marion Venn. Florence's expression changed from anger to surprise. Louisa had not slept outside Millbrook since Elias became ill. Florence asked to come. Louisa refused. The shop required attention and the exhibition pieces had to be returned. More than that, she did not want Florence to witness whatever waited at the end of the journey. Before leaving the room, Louisa looked at the nursing prospectus. She said only that Florence should not accept or refuse any future because Mrs. Harcourt changed a dinner invitation. It was not permission. Florence understood the difference and nodded without gratitude. Louisa went back to her room and opened the cream envelope from Ruth. It contained a cabinet photograph. Ruth sat stiffly beside Samuel, who wore a dark suit and held his hat on one knee. Between them stood a little girl of 6, with Louisa's eyes and Samuel's wide, serious mouth. Grace had one hand on each parent's shoulder, claiming them equally. On the back, Ruth had written that the photograph was taken on Grace's birthday. She hoped Louisa was well. She also wrote that Grace had begun asking why she had a grandmother who never came. There was no accusation after that, no plea, only an address in Cleveland, though Louisa had already known it. She placed the photograph on her bedside table. For the first time, she wondered how many of Ruth's earlier letters had sounded like accusations, only because Louisa had read them while preparing a defense. At dawn, she packed a small valise, wrapped Anna's cylinder in 2 layers of cotton, and sent a boy to reserve a place on the Cincinnati train. The journey south took most of the day. Ohio passed the window in winter bare fields, small towns, mill yards, and farmhouses set back from muddy roads. Coal smoke entered whenever the conductor opened the door between cars. Louisa sat upright with her valise beneath her feet and the cylinder box in her lap. She had time enough to remember 1881. Memory did not come as a complete story. It came as pieces that had survived because she had not considered them important. Anna's blue dress hanging behind the kitchen door. Elias standing at the wash basin after midnight, scrubbing mud from his cuffs. Their mother Harriet counting the money from the sale of the orchard lot, 6 packets of $100 notes, then locking them in a small iron cash box. Anna asking for her share of their father's estate so she could marry Jacob Venn. Harriet refusing because a daughter who married beneath herself, in her opinion, had proved herself unable to manage money. The empty cash box 3 days later. Every remembered fact pointed toward Anna. That was what Louisa had told herself for 26 years. Yet another memory returned now. On the morning the money vanished, Elias had paid a note at Copley's bank. He had come home relieved, lifted little Ruth to his shoulder, and brought Louisa a bolt of cream lawn from Columbus. She had never asked where the money came from. A husband's affairs belonged to him, and relief looked enough like prosperity if one loved the relieved man. Elias's dry goods partnership had been near failure that spring. Everyone knew it afterward. Louisa had believed Harriet's investment saved the business in June. She had not asked what saved it in March. At a stop outside Dayton, a woman with 2 children boarded. The younger child cried because soot had entered his eye. His mother soothed him with the corner of her handkerchief and an endless murmur. The sound carried Louisa back to another room. She had been 5 months with child in March of 1881. 2 years earlier, her first son had lived only 9 days. The doctor had warned Elias that excitement was bad for her, as if grief and truth were weather a husband might keep outside by closing windows. Anna had known how afraid Louisa was. She had slept beside Louisa for 3 nights after the baby died. She had combed Louisa's hair when Louisa could not bear anyone else to touch her. She had made Ruth's first white dress by hand, sewing seed pearls along a collar no infant required. Why would that Anna steal their mother's money and refuse one word of explanation? Louisa had asked herself the question once in the beginning. Then Harriet had answered it so often that the question lost its shape. The train reached Cincinnati after dark. Electric lights burned along the platform, but beyond the station the streets were wet and confusing. Louisa hired a cab to the address Marion had left on the strip inside the cylinder box. It was not a private house. The driver stopped before a 3-story brick building with a painted sign. River Street House for Women and Children. Light showed in the basement windows. Somewhere inside, a group of women were singing in a language Louisa did not know. Marion opened the door. She wore a plain dark skirt and white shirtwaist with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her split glove was gone. Ink stained 2 fingers of her right hand. She looked at Louisa's valise, then at the cotton-wrapped box. Louisa had prepared several sentences on the train. None survived the sight of Anna's eyes. She said, "I heard her." Marion stepped aside. The entrance hall was narrow and overheated. Children's coats hung from hooks at 2 heights. A row of boots dried on newspaper near an iron register. The singing came from below, where someone was teaching an evening class. Louisa heard a woman pronounce an English sentence, then 6 voices repeated with 6 different kinds of care. Marion led her to a small office. There was no carpet, only a braided rug and 2 wooden chairs. Notices in English, German, Italian, and Yiddish covered one wall. A photograph of Anna stood on the desk. She was older in it than Louisa had ever allowed her to become. Anna's hair was almost white at the temples. She wore spectacles on a chain and a dark dress with sleeves that had been mended so skillfully the repair looked decorative. One hand rested on the shoulder of a little girl. The other held a pair of shears. Louisa touched the edge of the frame. Marian said the picture had been taken in 1903 during the dressmaking class. Anna had taught women to alter second-hand clothes, cut children's coats from men's worn ones, and make shirtwaists that could be sold to shops without surrendering all the profit to a contractor. She had been paid very little. She had considered the work important. Louisa studied the room. She had imagined Anna in many forms over the years, though she told herself she never thought of her. In angry moments, Anna had been extravagant, careless, and defiant. In merciful moments, she had been a woman punished by her own choices. Louisa had never imagined her marking a hem for a tired immigrant mother while children learned English downstairs. Marian asked whether the recording had played through. Louisa said it had. She did not mention the courthouse room. Marian would learn soon enough. Millbrook gossip traveled quickly, and a story with a phonograph in it would travel faster. Marian brought coffee from the basement kitchen. It was strong and reheated, served in thick white cups. She did not apologize for either fact. Louisa asked when Anna had died. The answer was November of 1905. Pneumonia followed influenza, and her heart had already been weak. Anna had been ill for 12 days. She made the recording on the third day, before breathing became difficult. River Street House owned an Edison machine because its director believed hearing one's own speech helped adult students with English. Blank cylinders could be shaved and used again. Anna asked that one be saved. She had intended the cylinder for Louisa, but she had not trusted the post. Louisa asked why Marian had waited more than a year to bring it. Marian looked toward the photograph. Her father, Jacob, had asked her to wait until he was strong enough to travel with her. He wanted to stand at Louisa's door because Anna had once stood there alone. His health failed before they could go. He died the previous autumn. After that, Marian had waited for a less honorable reason. She had spent her childhood watching her mother recognize the postman's step. She knew the drawer where returned letters were kept. She knew Anna could stop a room with laughter and still become quiet on Ruth Mercer's birthday. Marian had not wanted to deliver one more piece of her mother to a woman who might send it back. Louisa felt the justice of that fear. She also felt anger. It arrived warm and welcome, offering relief from shame. She said Marian had known nothing of Louisa's life, her marriage, or what Anna's return might have destroyed. Marian agreed. She knew only what Anna had lost. That ended the anger before Louisa could use it. Marian opened the lower drawer of the desk and removed a packet tied with faded blue ribbon. It was thick enough to contain years. The first envelope was addressed to Mrs. Louisa Mercer, Sycamore Street, Millbrook, Ohio. The address belonged to the smaller house where Louisa and Elias had lived before Mercer House was built. A purple postmark showed it had been sent from Cincinnati in April 1881. Across the front, in Elias's unmistakable hand, were the words, "Return to sender." The seal remained unbroken. The next envelope had been sent in September, the next on Christmas Eve. Then came one from the following March, one in July, one in October. Later envelopes bore the address of Mercer House. Elias's hand changed slowly over the years. The letters grew heavier, then narrower. The final one had been posted on Ruth's 17th birthday. 24 envelopes, every seal intact. Louisa arranged them by date because her hands required work. She asked why Anna had not addressed a letter through Harriet, a neighbor, or the church. Marian said Anna had tried. Harriet's reply accused her of attempting to reopen the family's shame and warned that the sheriff still possessed a statement concerning the stolen money. A letter sent through an old school friend was returned with a note saying Louisa wished for no contact. Marian still had the note if Louisa wanted to see it. Louisa did not. She knew Elias's phrases before Marian repeated them. "My wife's health cannot bear disturbance. Respect the life she has chosen. Do not make your remorse her burden. They sounded considerate. Elias had been skilled at making fear sound like care. Louisa lifted the first envelope. The paper gave a little beneath her thumb, still flexible after 26 years. Anna had touched it while Louisa carried Ruth. She might have written at a kitchen table, Marion asleep nearby, Jacob reading over her shoulder. She might have waited for an answer before buying the next sheet. Louisa asked if she might open it. Marion said the letters belonged to Louisa. Anna had always said so. The first letter was only 3 pages. Anna wrote that she had reached Cincinnati safely, and that Jacob had found rooms above a cabinet-maker's shop. She wrote that she was not alone, though the family had forced them to marry earlier than planned. Then she came to the money. She did not excuse her silence. She described it. On the night before the cash box was found empty, Anna had entered Harriet's kitchen and seen Elias at the table with the notes spread before him. He admitted taking the key from Harriet's sewing basket. His business partner had signed his name to false orders and disappeared, leaving Elias responsible for debts he had concealed from Louisa. A creditor planned to bring the matter before the county prosecutor. Elias believed $600 would keep the store open and his name out of court. Anna threatened to wake Harriet. Elias knelt. Anna wrote that detail without ornament. He did not kneel to ask pardon. He knelt because his legs failed when he imagined Louisa learning the truth. He reminded Anna of the baby Louisa had buried. He reminded her of the child Louisa carried. He said the doctor feared another loss. Then he asked for 1 week. His uncle in Columbus had promised help. Elias would replace the money and confess before anyone need know. Anna agreed to 1 week. By morning, Harriet had discovered the empty box. Anna's earlier demand for her inheritance made suspicion immediate. When questioned, Anna said she had not taken the money but refused to say who had. Elias stood in the parlor and let her refuse. He did not repay the money in a week. He did not confess when Harriet barred Anna from the shop. He did not confess when neighbors began whispering. He did not confess when Reverend Cole asked Anna to appear before the church trustees and answer for the scandal. Anna waited, because each day made the next confession more dangerous. Elias told her Louisa had begun bleeding after the first confrontation. Whether that was true, Anna never knew. She saw Louisa only once more in Harriet's sewing room. Louisa stopped reading. The sewing room had remained clear in memory because Harriet had made certainty into a ceremony. 6 women were present, all members of the church sewing circle. Rain struck the windows. Anna stood beside a table covered with squares for a missionary quilt. Harriet had placed the empty iron cash box in the center, as if it were a witness. She demanded that Anna name the person she claimed to protect. Anna looked at Elias. Louisa remembered that now. She had once believed Anna looked toward the door. Elias had stood near it. He wore the brown coat Louisa had mended at the cuff. His face was pale. Anna looked directly at him, and he lowered his eyes. Then Louisa asked her sister a question. "Did you take the money?" Anna answered no. Louisa asked who did. Anna said she could not tell her. Harriet called that answer an admission. The other women accepted it because Harriet spoke first, and because disgrace is easier to witness when it has already been named. Louisa had walked to Anna and removed a small pearl brooch from her sister's collar. It had belonged to their grandmother. Louisa said a thief should not wear a Bell family piece. She remembered the pressure required to open the clasp. She remembered pricking Anna's neck. She had forgotten the drop of blood. Anna left Millbrook that night. On the train, 26 years later, Louisa had told herself Anna refused any explanation. The letter in her hand proved that Anna had given the only denial Louisa asked for. Louisa had simply preferred an accusation that came with a name. She continued reading. Anna wrote that Elias visited the Cincinnati rooms 2 weeks later. He brought $300 and begged her to accept it. By then, Harriet had sworn she would prosecute if Anna returned. Elias said a confession would ruin both households. Anna was newly pregnant. Jacob's work was uncertain. Ruth had been born early and Louisa was ill. Anna refused the money. She told Elias she would keep silent only until Louisa recovered. After that, he must tell the truth. If he did not, Anna would. The first letter was her attempt. Elias intercepted it. Louisa laid the pages on the desk. Marian did not watch her read. She sorted notices into piles, giving Louisa what privacy a small office allowed. Children ran down the hall. A bell rang below, followed by the scrape of benches. The ordinary life of the house continued around a truth that had stopped Louisa's. She opened 3 more letters. They did not repeat the accusation. Anna wrote about Jacob's work, a room with a view of brewery roofs, Marian's birth, and the difficulty of keeping milk cool in July. She wrote that Jacob had begun repairing talking machines for an exhibition company. She described hearing a human voice come out of a wax cylinder and thinking at once of all the things families could no longer pretend had not been said. In one letter, she enclosed a pressed violet. It had turned almost colorless. In another, she asked if Ruth still slept with one hand beside her face. In a third, she said she dreamed of the Bell kitchen whenever she made apple butter. The letters became less hopeful. The sentences about Elias disappeared. Anna stopped asking for an answer and began sending news as if setting it on a doorstep. After 11 years, even that ended. Louisa asked whether Anna had hated her. Marian considered before answering. She said Anna had been angry for a long time. Anger was different from hatred because it still expected something. Later, the anger changed into grief. In the final years, there had been neither. Anna had built a life too full to leave one room permanently reserved for Louisa. The words hurt more than hatred would have. Louisa looked again at the photograph. Anna's hand rested on the child's shoulder with complete attention. She had not spent 26 years waiting in a dim room. She had loved Jacob. She had raised Marian. She had taught women to sew. She had acquired white hair and spectacles and habits Louisa did not know. The lost years had not been empty. They had simply been lost to Louisa. Marian offered her a room for the night at River Street House. The residence rooms were occupied, but there was a cot in the sewing classroom. Louisa almost chose a hotel. Then she remembered how quickly she had used respectability to place distance between herself and Marian in the shop. She accepted the cot. The classroom occupied the top floor under a sloping roof. 6 treadle machines stood in 2 rows. Paper patterns hung from nails. On a shelf were baskets of buttons sorted by color, not value. Anna's old work table remained beside the window because no one had found a reason to move it. Louisa ran her palm across the scarred wood. Marian brought clean sheets and a wool blanket. Before leaving, she placed the pearl brooch on the table. Anna had kept it, though Louisa remembered tearing it away. The clasp was bent. A dark stain remained near the hinge where the pin had touched Anna's neck. Marian explained that Jacob found it on the sewing room floor after Anna fled Millbrook. He had gone back at dawn to look for a thimble she thought she had dropped. The brooch lay beneath the missionary quilt. Anna never wore it again. She kept it because it was the one family possession no one had managed to return through the post. Louisa held it under the gaslight. She asked Marian to keep it. Marian said she did not want a Bell family piece if it came as payment for pain. Louisa told her it was not payment. It was Anna's because Louisa had no right to remove it. That made it Marian's now. Marian closed Louisa's fingers around the brooch. She said, rights discovered after burial were easy to grant. Then she left. Louisa sat alone among the sewing machines. On the wall hung a child's practice sampler. The stitches wandered, tightened, loosened, and finally became even. Anna had written corrections in pencil along the edge. Louisa recognized the shape of her capital A. Below, the evening class ended. Women called good night to one another. A baby cried, then quieted. Pipes knocked inside the wall. Louisa opened Ruth's photograph and stood it beside Anna's. The two faces did not resemble each other. Ruth had Elias's brow. Anna's was narrower, more like Harriet's. Yet the photographs belonged together because both women had learned to live beyond Louisa's refusal. She did not sleep for a long time. Near dawn, she opened the final returned letter. Anna had written it when Ruth turned 17. The message was brief. She said Marion had begun asking why she possessed cousins she could not meet. Anna no longer knew what answer protected anyone. She asked Louisa to write one sentence in her own hand. I know, or I do not know. Elias had returned the question unopened. Louisa folded the page along its old creases. At breakfast, she told Marion that she would take the letters to Millbrook. Marion asked what she intended to do with them. Louisa said she did not yet know. It was the first honest answer she had given her niece. The Millbrook Evening Herald printed the story before Louisa's train reached home. It occupied half a column beneath a report about sewer bonds. The headline asked whether a voice from beyond the grave had accused a respected merchant. Anna was called the vanished Bell daughter. Elias was called the late civic benefactor. Louisa was described as visibly overcome, which was untrue. She had remained standing. The article did not mention that Anna had been refused at the church sewing room, or that Marion had been turned out of Louisa's shop. Public memory preferred its cruelty without witnesses. Florence met Louisa at the station. She had brought the closed carriage, though the evening was clear. Louisa understood before entering it that Florence wished to spare her the walk past the newspaper office. On the drive home, Florence said Mrs. Harcourt had called twice. She had not called to ask if Louisa was well. She wanted assurance that no relative of Anna's would appear in Millbrook, and that Louisa planned to denounce the recording as a malicious fabrication. Edwin had sent his own note, but his mother's coachman returned before Florence could answer it. Louisa asked what the note said. Florence looked out at the passing houses. Edwin had asked her not to believe his silence meant agreement. He needed time to speak with his father. Time, Louisa repeated. The word had changed during her journey. Once, time meant composure. It meant waiting until anger cooled and proper language could be found. Now it looked like a hallway in which frightened people kept asking others to stand while they locked doors. At Mercer House, the cylinder went back into Elias's study. Anna's letters filled the bottom drawer of Louisa's writing desk. The pearl brooch remained in her reticule. Marion had refused it again at the station, saying she might accept it one day, but not while both of them were still measuring what it meant. Louisa respected that refusal more than she had respected many agreements. The following morning, Mrs. Harcourt arrived before the shop opened. She wore a sable collar despite the mild weather. No one in Millbrook could enter a room more completely. Even when she took the plain chair near the counter, the shop seemed to arrange itself around her. She began with sympathy. The dead, she observed, sometimes left behind confusion that the living had to contain. She had known Elias for 30 years and considered the accusation absurd. A man who subscribed to the hospital fund and served on the school board did not steal from his mother-in-law. Louisa thought of Elias on his knees in Harriet's kitchen. Good works performed over 30 years did not reach backward and close his hand before it took the key. Mrs. Harcourt moved from sympathy to consequence. Edwin's prospects at the bank depended on judgment. Florence, though charming and well-educated, possessed no fortune beyond what Louisa might leave her. She could not also bring a public quarrel, a thieving aunt, an Italian cousin by marriage, and an unidentified claimant from a Cincinnati settlement house.
The phrase Italian cousin by marriage referred to Ruth. Louisa heard it and, for the first time, heard the ugliness she had once disguised as concern. Mrs. Harcourt offered a remedy. Louisa could publish a brief notice stating that Anna had stolen the money, fled with a man, and later attempted to revise the facts. She could say the cylinder was obtained under false pretenses and played by accident. If Marion returned, Louisa could refuse to receive her.
With firmness, the matter might fade before summer. In return, Sunday dinner could be restored. The proposal was not spoken as a bargain. Respectable people rarely named their bargains while making them. Florence entered from the workroom, carrying a box of silk roses. She stopped when she saw Mrs. Harcourt. Louisa could not tell how much she had heard. Mrs. Harcourt smiled at her. It was a smile intended to bring a young woman back inside the boundary of good sense. Louisa asked Florence to leave the roses and remain. Then she told Mrs. Harcourt there would be no denial in the newspaper. The cylinder was Anna's voice. The letters Elias returned were in Louisa's possession. Louisa did not yet know every fact, but she knew enough to refuse another lie. Mrs. Harcourt's face did not harden. It became regretful, which was worse. She said Louisa's loyalty to a dead sister was understandable, but Florence would pay for it. Louisa answered that Florence had paid for other people's fear long enough. Florence looked at her then. Mrs. Harcourt stood. At the door, she warned that a woman could lose in one candid afternoon what a family had built in 40 careful years. Louisa said that appeared to be true. After the door closed, Florence placed the silk roses on the counter. Her eyes had filled, but she refused to let the tears fall in the shop. She asked whether Louisa had meant what she said. Louisa told her she would no longer prepare Florence for a life whose chief qualification was Mrs. Harcourt's approval. If Florence wanted nursing, she should apply. If she wanted Edwin, she should require him to come to the decision himself instead of sending his mother ahead of him. If she wanted both, she must discover whether Edwin could endure a wife with work and opinions. Florence gave a short laugh that turned into a sob. She covered her mouth. Louisa did not embrace her. They were in the front of the shop, and Louisa's body still believed tenderness required privacy. She did place one hand over Florence's on the counter. It was a beginning, not a cure. That afternoon, Louisa closed early and carried Harriet Bell's iron cash box down from the attic. It had been empty since 1881. After Harriet's death, Louisa kept it because throwing away iron seemed wasteful. The box was smaller than memory had made it. Its black paint had bubbled with age. The lock bore scratches around the keyhole. Louisa set it on Elias's desk and examined the hinge, the handle, and the little stamped maker's mark. Nothing about it could declare who opened it 26 years before. Then she remembered Elias's key ring. For most of their marriage, he carried a flat leather case containing keys to the shop, warehouse, desk, and house. When the case wore out, he dropped it into a box of metal fittings in the cellar. Louisa found it after an hour among brass latches, drawer pulls, and 2 rusted curtain rods. 4 keys remained. 1 opened the old warehouse. 1 belonged to the desk. 1 was too small for any door Louisa remembered. The 4th opened Harriet's cash box. It turned stiffly, then gave a small, clean click. Louisa sat on the cellar step with the open box on her knees. The key did not prove when Elias used it. Perhaps Harriet had given it to him later. Perhaps he had acquired it after her death. Louisa's mind produced explanations because it had practiced for years. But Anna's letter described Elias taking the key from Harriet's sewing basket. The scratches around the lock suggested a copy made imperfectly. Elias had kept the copy all his life. Louisa carried both box and key upstairs. She could have stopped there. The voice, the letters, and the key formed a truth strong enough for any heart that wanted truth. Yet Louisa had spent 30 years fitting hats to heads by fractions of an inch. She trusted what aligned.
There was one person in Millbrook who might remember the night from outside the family. Minerva Cole had been the minister's wife in 1881. She was 84 now and lived with a widowed niece near the canal. Her eyesight had failed, but her memory remained exact whenever the subject interested her. Louisa visited the next day. The house smelled of camphor and baked pears. Minerva sat beneath a window with a blanket over her knees. She recognized Louisa by voice and asked, without greeting, whether Anna had truly put hers into a phonograph. Louisa said yes. Minerva smiled. She remarked that Anna had always found new machinery more interesting than most sermons. Louisa placed the cash-box key in the old woman's palm and asked what she remembered. At first, Minerva repeated the public account. Harriet lost $600.
Anna wished to marry Jacob against her mother's will. Anna would not name the guilty person. She left town. Then Louisa asked whether Minerva had ever doubted it. The old woman's fingers closed around the key. She admitted that doubt had come immediately. On the day of the sewing room confrontation, Anna looked toward Elias before refusing to answer. Minerva saw it. So did Reverend Cole. Afterward, her husband wanted to question Elias, but Harriet forbade it. She said the family had suffered enough and that dragging a son-in-law into gossip would threaten Louisa's health. 2 years later, Minerva entered Harriet's parlor without being announced. Elias stood beside the mantel. $600 lay on the table. Harriet was crying. Minerva heard Elias say the amount had been restored with interest and the matter must remain between them. Harriet told him Anna could never be restored as neatly as money. Then she noticed Minerva.
Reverend Cole wished to make Elias confess before the church trustees. Harriet threatened to deny everything and remove the family from the congregation. She argued that Anna was married, gone, and beyond local repair, while Louisa and Ruth still had to live in Millbrook. Exposing Elias would only exchange one ruined daughter for another. Minerva and her husband yielded. She had called it mercy for years. Age had given it another name: cowardice. Louisa sat very still. Minerva reached for her hand and missed. Louisa moved closer. The old woman said she had expected Anna to return one day and force the truth into daylight. When Anna did not, everyone accepted silence as evidence that she had found another life. Minerva had not considered that Anna's letters might be intercepted. She had not considered many things that would have required action. Louisa asked why Minerva had never told her after Harriet and Elias died. The old woman did not defend herself.
She said each year made the confession uglier, and ugliness encourages delay. At 84, one begins to see how often people wait for a proper moment. That is only another name for never. Before Louisa left, Minerva asked to hear the cylinder. Louisa promised to bring it. Outside, the canal road was bright with thin spring sun. Boys rolled a hoop past a coal wagon. A woman shook a rug from an upstairs window. The world had the indecency to look ordinary. Louisa walked to the Methodist church. The sewing room stood behind the sanctuary. It had been repainted twice, and the long table was new. Harriet's missionary quilt had gone to a school in Kentucky decades earlier. Yet Louisa knew exactly where Anna had stood. She crossed the room and placed her fingers against the wall. At 58, she could judge her 32-year-old self with perfect cruelty. The younger Louisa had been pregnant, frightened, obedient to a formidable mother, and desperate to believe her husband. Those facts explained her. They did not absolve her. Anna had said no. Louisa had heard the word and chosen not to believe it. That evening, Edwin Harcourt came to Mercer House alone. He waited in the parlor while Florence finished at the shop. He was 27, well-dressed, and pale with the effort of disobeying his family. Louisa felt some sympathy for him. She no longer mistook sympathy for permission. Edwin said he cared for Florence and intended to ask her to marry him.
His parents believed the timing should be postponed until the scandal passed. He had come to assure Louisa that his feelings had not altered. Louisa asked whether his plans had. He admitted they had, for the present. She asked what he would do if Florence entered nurse's training in Cleveland. He stared at her. Florence had not told him.
Louisa replied that Florence had not yet applied. The fact that she considered it should not require concealment from a man who intended to direct the rest of her life. Edwin's first response was that nursing was unnecessary. He could provide a home. Then, to his credit, he heard himself. Louisa watched the conflict cross his face. It was not evil, it was inheritance. His father had taught him that provision earned authority. His mother had taught him that family peace depended on women accepting the terms of it gracefully. Edwin had mistaken those lessons for nature. Florence arrived before he found an answer. Louisa left them in the parlor. Through the closed door, she heard no raised voices. Once, Florence cried. Later, Edwin walked out, carrying his hat in his hand, instead of wearing it. Florence came to the dining room. She said he had asked for time. Louisa almost repeated her new judgment of that word. She stopped. Florence had the right to decide what waiting meant in her own life. Instead, Louisa asked what Florence had asked for. Florence said she had asked him not to return until he knew whether he wanted her, or merely the version of her his mother could invite to dinner. Louisa nodded. They ate cold roast beef and bread. Halfway through the meal, Florence reached across the table and took Louisa's hand. This time, Louisa held it properly. The next morning, Louisa went to the newspaper office. She carried Anna's first letter, Elias's copied key, and the address of River Street House. She did not carry the cylinder. Anna's voice had already been used once for a spectacle without her permission. Louisa would not hand it to another room merely because she now believed it. The editor expected a denial. Louisa gave him a correction. She stated that Annabelle had not stolen Harriet Bell's $600 in 1881. Elias Mercer had taken it during a business crisis and returned it later. Anna had protected Louisa at great cost. Harriet Bell, Reverend Cole, Minerva Cole, Elias, and Louisa had all failed to clear her name when they could. Louisa would not offer reasons, as if reasons were payment. The editor asked whether she understood what printing the statement would do to Elias's reputation. Louisa said yes. He asked whether she understood what it would do to hers. She said she was beginning to. He wanted to quote Anna's recording. Louisa refused. He wanted to publish portions of the letters. She refused that too. Facts, she told him, belonged to the town, because the town had repeated the lie. Anna's private longing did not. The correction appeared on the front page the next afternoon. It was shorter than the first article, and more damaging. 3 customers cancelled fittings before noon. One sent back a hat that had already been trimmed and demanded her deposit. Another asked Elsie, in a whisper loud enough to carry through the curtain, whether Mrs. Mercer intended to give the shop to those settlement people. Mrs. Harcourt's unfinished hat remained in its box. No messenger came for it. Other women entered only to look at Louisa. They bought pins or a yard of ribbon so the visit could pass as business. At 2, a shirtwaist worker laid 12 cents on the counter and asked for a length of black tape. Before leaving, she told Louisa that her own sister had been sent away after a factory foreman accused her of theft. No correction had ever appeared in a newspaper. The woman did not offer comfort. She offered recognition, which was steadier. The next day, Reverend Cole's successor announced that the old accusation against Annabelle would be removed from the congregation's membership record. He did not say how a line written in ink could be removed without leaving evidence of the blade. Louisa asked that a new line be added instead. Accusation found false, 1907. The trustees preferred less detail. Louisa insisted. By the end of the week, the Ladies' Improvement League requested a special meeting to consider whether Louisa should remain chair of Women's Industries. The invitation used the phrase, "recent family disclosures." It did not use Anna's name. Louisa prepared to attend. Then a letter arrived from Marion. It was only one page. The Cincinnati newspaper had repeated the Millbrook correction, adding the address of River Street House and describing Anna as a disgraced seamstress who recorded a deathbed accusation. Reporters had questioned women entering the building. One donor withdrew support, fearing notoriety. Marion wrote that Louisa had spent 26 years denying Anna a voice and 2 days deciding how that voice should be used once it became useful to her conscience. The sentence left no comfortable place to stand. Louisa had believed the public lie required public correction. She still believed it. Yet she had not asked Marion what publicity might cost the living. She had protected Anna's letters while exposing Anna's daughter. Even repentance had become an act Louisa expected others to receive gratefully. She began an answer 3 times. The first explained why speed had mattered. She tore it up. The second listed the newspaper's errors and offered money to replace the withdrawn donation. She tore that up too. The third was shorter. Louisa wrote that Marion was right. She should have asked. She could not undo the article, but she would write to the Cincinnati editor and refuse any further interview. If River Street House lost funds because of her action, she would help only in whatever manner Marion and the director chose. She did not ask forgiveness. She posted the letter herself. No answer came before the league meeting. 38 women gathered in the courthouse assembly room. The phonograph table had been removed, leaving the pale square on the floor where its legs had stood. Mrs. Harcourt sat in the front row. Florence sat at the back in her plain work dress, though Louisa had told her attendance was unnecessary. The league president opened with remarks about unity. She praised Louisa's years of service, then suggested that private grief had impaired her judgment. A temporary withdrawal, she said, might preserve everyone's dignity. Louisa listened. She had prepared a speech defending the correction, but Marion's letter remained in her pocket. It had taught her suspicion of speeches that made one person's conscience expensive for everyone else. When invited to answer, she stood and said she would resign as chair if the members wished it. She would not resign her membership, deny the facts, or allow the league's record of the exhibition to describe Anna's cylinder as fraudulent. Anna Bell had been named publicly as a thief in a room maintained by many of their mothers. Her innocence would also be named publicly. Mrs. Harcourt asked whether every youthful error must be dragged from its grave. Louisa said the error had not been in a grave. It had been living in Anna's name, Marion's childhood, Ruth's estrangement, Florence's prospects, and Louisa's marriage. People called a wrong buried when only the injured person was out of sight. That was the longest statement she made. The vote removed her as chair by 21 to 16, with 1 abstention. The result hurt. Louisa had expected relief from sacrifice, as if choosing truth would make consequence noble enough not to sting. Instead, she felt dismissed, embarrassed, and furious with women she had worked beside for 20 years. She also felt free of the need to persuade them before acting. As the meeting ended, 5 women approached quietly. One squeezed her arm. Another said nothing, but wrote her name on the back of a calling card and indicated she had voted no. Small-town courage often arrived after the vote, when it cost less. Louisa accepted it without mistaking it for more. Mrs. Harcourt passed without speaking. Outside, Edwin waited beneath the courthouse clock. He had come for Florence. Mrs. Harcourt saw him and stopped. For a moment, mother and son faced each other across the pavement, while carriages moved around the square. Edwin did not make a declaration. He simply walked to Florence and asked if he might accompany her home. Florence told him she was going first to the post office. She had completed her application to the nursing school. He said he would walk there too. It was not an ending. Louisa had learned to distrust endings that arrived before anyone had changed. But when Florence joined him, she did not take the arm he offered. She walked beside him, carrying her own envelope. Louisa returned to the shop alone. Business remained poor for several weeks. She reduced Elsie's hours only after explaining the accounts and offering to help her find extra work. The phrase, explaining the accounts, would once have seemed improper to Louisa. An employer decided, an apprentice adjusted. Anna's voice had made many ordinary arrangements look like smaller silences. She began opening the workroom on Tuesday evenings to women who needed the cutting table. The idea came from Anna's photograph, though Louisa did not advertise it as memorial or charity. Charity placed the giver above the receiver. The women paid a nickel for gas and thread if they could, and nothing if they could not. In exchange, they swept the floor and shared patterns. The first evening only 2 came. By May there were 14, including 3 women from the Italian parish who spoke little English. Louisa knew no Italian. She taught by gesture, chalk, and demonstration. A straight seam required no common language. One of the women, Teresa Bianchi, recognized Samuel Moretti's surname when Florence mentioned Ruth. Her husband had worked beside Samuel at a Cleveland lithography shop. Teresa said he was steady, clever with color, and foolishly proud of his little girl. Louisa carried that description home like a found coin. She still did not write to Ruth. Each evening she placed the cabinet photograph on her desk. Each morning she returned it to the drawer before Florence came down. She composed letters in her head and rejected them. Some began with explanations. Others began with news. None began with the sentence Ruth deserved. I was wrong. It was easier to publish a correction about the dead than to send 4 words to the living. Louisa knew this. Knowledge did not yet become action. In late May, Marian answered. River Street House had lost 1 donor and gained 2 after the publicity. The director wanted no money from Louisa unless it came without conditions and without Anna's name in the newspaper. They did need 3 sewing machines, a new stove for the nursery, and someone willing to arrange regular shipments of usable fabric remnants from Millbrook manufacturers. Marian wrote that an apology was not made false by its lateness. It was made false when it demanded to be the final word. She accepted Louisa's apology as a first word. Louisa read that line many times. She arranged for fabric remnants before buying the stove. The mill owners preferred to burn or discard offcuts rather than risk undermining retail prices. Louisa persuaded 2 by promising public thanks, 1 by threatening to mention the waste at a league meeting she no longer chaired, and another through a foreman whose wife attended Tuesday evenings. She bought 3 second-hand treadle machines from a closed shirtwaist room and paid a mechanic to restore them. She did not attach a plaque. In June, Marian came to Millbrook. She arrived on a Monday when the shop was closed. Louisa met her at the station. No carriage had been hired and no newspaper had been told. They walked up Sycamore Street beneath elms heavy with new leaves. Marian carried a carpet bag and a narrow wooden case. She had accepted Louisa's invitation to stay at Mercer House, but made clear that she would remain only 2 nights. Florence welcomed her without the hesitation Louisa deserved. She had prepared the room overlooking the garden and placed Anna's photograph on the dresser. Marian noticed the gesture and touched Florence's shoulder. At dinner, the 3 women struggled with the politeness of strangers who shared too much history. Florence asked about River Street House. Marian asked about nursing. Louisa carved the chicken and listened to Anna's daughter describe women from Sicily, Galicia, and Kentucky learning to cut sleeves at the same table. After dessert, Louisa brought out the returned letters. She had read all of them by then. She had kept them in Anna's order, repaired no tears, and erased none of Elias's markings. Marian examined the packet but did not take it. Louisa said she wished Marian to decide where the letters belonged. Marian answered that they belonged to both sisters,
and neither could decide now. They placed them in a small cedar box and agreed the box would remain with Marian, while Louisa could ask to read them whenever she wished. The arrangement satisfied no legal principle. It satisfied the truth better than ownership did. Then Louisa gave Marian Harriet Bell's will, the house on Sycamore Street, the millinery shop, and nearly all Louisa's savings had descended in some degree from Harriet. Under Ohio law and Harriet's will, Anna received $1. Harriet had written that the amount represented full settlement with a daughter who had forfeited natural claims through misconduct.
Louisa had found the paper after returning from Cincinnati. She could not read that sentence without hearing the church trustee's knife scrape Anna's name from a page. She offered Marian half the present value of the property inherited through Harriet. Marian refused before Louisa finished. Louisa expected anger and had prepared to insist. Marian's reason stopped her. Anna had not spent her life dreaming of Mercer House or the shop. She had wanted her name cleared and her sister's answer. Turning her pain into a property calculation would repeat Elias's mistake, measuring what could not be repaid in dollars. Louisa said money still mattered. Anna's family had lived with less because Harriet disinherited her. Marian agreed. She did not believe refusing money made her morally superior. She believed the choice was hers. If Louisa wished to make restitution, River Street House needed a permanent sewing room. It could be established in Anna's name only if the women who used it were not expected to perform gratitude. Louisa accepted the condition. Marian smiled for the first time since entering the shop in March. The smile made her look less like Anna, not more. Louisa was glad. Marian had spent enough time being used as evidence of another woman. That night they played the cylinder in Elias's study. Marian had heard it only twice, once after Anna's death and once before traveling to Millbrook. She stood near the window while Louisa wound the machine. Florence sat on the edge of a chair. The voice began. No public room surrounded it now. There were no reporters, no Harcourts, no women pretending not to listen. Anna spoke to her sister, while her daughter and niece heard. When the recording reached Elias's name, Louisa did not move. When Anna asked whether Louisa knew, Louisa answered the machine. I did not know. Marian closed her eyes. The cylinder continued to its final warning about inherited silence. Then the needle entered the empty groove. Florence lifted it gently. For a while, none of them spoke. The machine gave small, cooling clicks. Louisa told Marian that Anna had saved her marriage, or believed she had. Louisa no longer knew whether to call that love, sacrifice, or an injury Anna had been taught to perform for her elder sister. Perhaps it had been all three. Marian said her mother had wondered the same thing. In her final years, she stopped calling the silence a gift. A gift could be refused. No one had allowed Louisa to refuse because no one told her its price. Louisa looked at Elias's desk. She had loved him. That fact remained and complicated every other fact. He had been patient during Ruth's fevers. He had read the newspaper aloud when Louisa's eyes hurt. He brought roses without understanding why she preferred lilacs. He had also let Anna carry his disgrace, intercepted her letters, and built a respectable life inside the space her exile created. Love did not acquit him. Wrong did not erase every tender morning. Louisa would have preferred one simple judgment. The dead rarely cooperated. Marian opened the wooden case she had brought from Cincinnati. Inside lay a blank brown wax cylinder and a small recording attachment wrapped in flannel. It had belonged to Jacob. He had used it to make family recordings and to take dictation for customers who wished to send spoken greetings. Marian said Anna had wanted Louisa's answer, even if it came too late for her to hear. A spoken answer, she thought, might belong with the spoken question. Louisa touched the blank cylinder.
She said she could not address Anna as if death were another post office delay. Marian did not press her. She left the case on the desk. Before bed, Marian asked about Ruth.
Louisa had told her almost nothing, but Anna's letters mentioned Ruth so often that the question was unavoidable. Louisa showed her the photograph. Marian studied Grace's face. She said Anna would have called the child her grandniece and sent her something badly wrapped at Christmas. Then she asked whether Louisa had answered. Louisa said not yet. Marian placed the photograph back into Louisa's hand. She did not repeat Anna's warning. She did not need to. Marian left on Wednesday morning. Louisa stood on the platform until the train became a dark line beyond the freight sheds. Then she went directly to the ticket window and asked the fare to Cleveland. The clerk offered times for the next day. Louisa bought a ticket for that afternoon. She did not return home to compose a letter. She sent Florence a telegram from the station. Going to Ruth, home Friday or when welcome. Do not worry. The final 3 words cost extra. She paid without resentment. On the train, she carried no cylinder and no packet of evidence. She took only a valise, Ruth's photograph, and the pearl brooch Marian had left on the study desk that morning. A note beneath it said the brooch had waited long enough in boxes. Marian believed Louisa should decide whether it would continue as a badge of family possession or become something freely given. Louisa had no plan for it. Cleveland met her with lake wind, smoke, and the noise of a city too large to care about Millbrook's scandal. Streetcars crossed in front of the station. Newsboys shouted headlines unrelated to Annabelle. Louisa felt insulted, then relieved. Ruth's address led to a narrow brick house divided into 2 flats near the lithography works. Laundry moved above the small rear yards. Children played beside ash barrels. The air smelled of ink, cabbage, coal, and rain from the lake. Louisa stood across the street for several minutes. She understood Anna's first visit to the shop now. A door was only wood and hinges until the person behind it possessed the power to deny your place in the family. Then the distance from pavement to threshold could become 26 years. Louisa crossed. A little girl opened the door before she knocked a second time. Grace wore a blue pinafore with one pocket hanging loose. Her hair had been cut to her shoulders, practical and uneven. She studied Louisa openly, then called for her mother. Ruth appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. The photograph had prepared Louisa for her daughter's face, but not for movement. Ruth tilted her head exactly as she had at 17 when deciding whether a statement deserved argument. A pale line crossed one wrist where she had burned herself years earlier on Louisa's curling iron. Louisa had forgotten the mark and remembered the cry. Neither woman embraced the other. Ruth asked if someone had died. Louisa answered no. Then she corrected herself. Someone had died, but not recently, and that was part of why she had come. The explanation was already becoming a shelter. Louisa stopped it. She said she had been wrong about Samuel, wrong about the marriage, and wrong to punish Ruth for choosing a life Louisa had not selected. She had come in person because a letter would let her arrange every sentence until it hid more than it said. Grace looked from one woman to the other. Ruth sent her to wash before supper. The child went slowly, listening with her whole back. Ruth did not invite Louisa inside. She asked why the truth had taken 8 years. Louisa said it had taken longer. She had learned the habit from Harriet and practiced it on Anna before practicing it on Ruth. She did not expect that explanation to lessen anything. Ruth's face changed at Anna's name. The newspaper story had reached Cleveland. Samuel brought the article home 2 weeks earlier, but Ruth assumed Louisa would deny it. She had waited for a letter. Louisa said she had waited too, for Ruth to apologize, to admit the marriage had been rash, to ask again in a more acceptable way. Ruth laughed once, without humor. She said she had spent 3 years asking. After that, she sent photographs because she wanted Grace to know she had tried. Louisa looked toward the room where the child had disappeared. She asked if she might come in. Ruth hesitated long enough to make the cost visible. Then she stepped aside. The flat was clean and crowded. A kitchen occupied the rear, a parlor the front, and 2 bedrooms opened from a short hall. Color proofs from Samuel's work leaned above the mantel, fruit labels, a theater poster, a bright advertisement for soap. A painted wooden horse stood beside the stove with 1 wheel missing. Louisa had imagined Ruth living in disorder because the marriage began in disobedience. Instead, the table was scrubbed, the curtains mended, and books were stacked beneath every chair because there was no shelf room. Respectability existed there without asking Louisa to certify it. Samuel came home carrying a metal lunch pail. He stopped when he saw her. He was taller than the photograph suggested. His dark hair was thinning at the front, and blue ink marked the side of his thumb. He removed his cap, but did not offer his hand. Ruth told him that her mother had come to apologize. Samuel answered that this was useful information and went to wash. Louisa deserved the coldness. Accepting what one deserved was less graceful in practice than in moral stories. At supper, Grace asked why Louisa had never visited. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Samuel concentrated on cutting bread. Louisa could have said distance, illness, misunderstanding, or family difficulty. All were partly true and wholly evasive. She told Grace that she had been proud and unkind. She had believed grown children must obey their mothers in important choices, and when Ruth did not, Louisa stayed away to punish her. It was wrong. Grace considered this. She asked whether Louisa was still unkind. Louisa said she hoped less so. The child accepted the answer more readily than the adults. Samuel asked about Anna after Grace went to bed. He had read the newspaper but distrusted its appetite. Louisa described the cylinder, the letters, and Elias's key. She did not present the story as a revelation that made her better. She described each choice she had made after hearing it, including the article published without Marion's consent. Ruth listened without interruption. When Louisa finished, Ruth said she had always wondered what happened to Anna. As a child, she once found a Christmas parcel in Elias's study addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Elias took it away. 2 days later, he gave Ruth a doll in a dress too finely sewn to have come from the Millbrook store. Ruth believed the doll was from Anna. Louisa remembered it: brown china hair, kid leather arms, a green wool dress with 24 tiny buttons. Elias said he bought it from a traveling salesman. Ruth slept with it until one arm tore. After the quarrel over Samuel, she left it at Mercer House because Louisa said no decent married woman began housekeeping with childhood toys. The cruelty of the sentence returned whole. Louisa promised to find the doll. Ruth answered that she did not want promises made in the first heat of remorse. She wanted to know what Louisa would do when regret became ordinary and inconvenient. Louisa said she did not know. She hoped to continue. Samuel looked at her for the first time without open distrust. He asked where she planned to sleep. Louisa had not planned that far. There was a hotel near the station. She rose, though Ruth had not asked her to leave. At the door, Grace came from the hallway in her nightdress and gave Louisa a folded sheet of paper. She had drawn 4 people beside a house. The 4th person stood apart from the other 3. Grace explained that she did not know yet where grandmother belonged. Louisa folded the paper carefully. She said that was fair. The hotel room faced an alley. Delivery wagons began moving before dawn. Louisa lay awake and imagined Ruth's first years in the flat, pregnancy without her mother, Grace's birth, Samuel carrying coal upstairs, winter illnesses, birthday cakes, quarrels. Ordinary mornings. Louisa had made her absence the central fact of Ruth's life because it was central to her own conscience. In truth, Ruth had built thousands of days around it. At breakfast, a message waited at the desk. Ruth asked Louisa to come at 10 if she still wished to talk.
This time, Louisa did not hire a cab.
She rode the streetcar, changed once, and walked the final blocks. At the corner she bought apples, then nearly left them outside because bringing fruit looked too much like assuming welcome. She carried them in and asked where they should go. Ruth was alone. Samuel had taken Grace to visit his mother. For 2 hours, Ruth told the story Louisa had avoided hearing. Samuel's father came from Tuscany as a stonecutter. His mother, Lucia, took in washing after an accident injured her husband. Samuel left school at 14, educated himself through the library, and learned lithography because he could draw. None of this impressed Louisa when Ruth first described him. She had asked whether his mother received laundry at the front door. Ruth remembered the exact question. Louisa did too. At their first meeting, Louisa had spoken slowly to Louisa Mercer, though the woman understood English. She inspected the family's parlor and asked Samuel whether Catholics expected wives to surrender their own church. She never asked what he admired in Ruth. When Samuel proposed, Louisa threatened to remove Ruth from Harriet's will and forbid Florence to see her. Elias was already ill and urged peace, but he defined peace as Ruth yielding. Ruth married at the county courthouse with Samuel's parents present. Louisa did not attend. 3 weeks later, Ruth came to Mercer House. She stood on the porch in rain and asked to speak alone. Louisa remained behind the parlor curtain while Elias told her that her mother was indisposed. Louisa remembered the day. She had heard Ruth's voice through the wall. She had believed staying hidden preserved authority. Now, it joined the image of Anna at the shop door so precisely that Louisa pressed both hands to her face. Ruth stopped speaking. Louisa lowered her hands and asked her to continue. After Grace was born, Ruth wrote monthly for a year. She sent a lock of the baby's hair, which came back because Louisa refused the registered envelope. Samuel wanted her to stop. Ruth continued until Grace's first birthday. After that, she sent 1 photograph each year and expected nothing. She had not forgiven Louisa. She did not know whether she wanted to. She had allowed her inside because Grace deserved the chance to form her own judgment, and because Anna's story made wasted years feel suddenly dangerous. Louisa said forgiveness was not a condition of her return. If Ruth wanted 1 visit and no more, Louisa would accept it. If she wanted letters but no visits, Louisa would write. If she wanted silence, Louisa would not call it ingratitude. Ruth looked exhausted. She said she did not want silence. She wanted time that belonged to her, not time granted as a test. Louisa agreed. Before leaving, she placed the pearl brooch on the table. She told Ruth its history, how she tore it from Anna's collar, how Jacob found it, how Marion returned it. Louisa did not offer the brooch as inheritance or apology. She asked Ruth to keep it until Grace was old enough to hear the story. Then Grace could decide whether to wear it, give it back, or melt it into something no bell woman would recognize. Ruth opened the clasp. The bent hinge resisted. She saw the dark stain. After a long moment, she accepted. That afternoon, Louisa met Louisa Mercer. The visit was not planned. Samuel's mother came to Ruth's flat, carrying Grace's repaired pinafore, and found Louisa helping replace the loose pocket. Lucia was a broad, handsome woman of 60, with white hair drawn into a knot. Her English was better than Louisa's manners had ever been. Lucia did not pretend pleasure. She greeted Louisa and began preparing coffee. Louisa apologized for the way she had treated her family. She named the laundry question. She named her refusal to attend the wedding. She named the years in which Lucia became Grace's only grandmother because Louisa considered herself the wronged person. Lucia listened while measuring coffee into the pot. Then she said one short sentence. "You missed a good child." She meant Grace. She also meant Ruth and perhaps Samuel. Louisa said she knew. Lucia poured 4 cups. She did not forgive Louisa or ask her to stay for dinner. She did place sugar within reach. It was enough for one afternoon. Louisa returned to Millbrook on Saturday, not Friday. Florence met her at the house. The nursing school had invited her for an interview. Edwin had written twice, but Florence had not decided whether affection could survive the work required of it. Louisa told her not to hurry, for fear that slowness resembled cowardice. Time could also be honest when everyone knew what it was for. Together they searched the attic for Ruth's doll. They found it in a trunk beneath 2 winter quilts. The green dress was faded. One kid-leather arm remained torn, and the tiny buttons had left rust-colored marks where their wire shanks passed through the cloth. Inside the hem, sewn so finely Louisa needed a magnifying glass, were the initials A.V. Anna Then. The parcel Elias intercepted had reached his study. He had removed Anna's name, given the doll as his own gift, and allowed Ruth to love it without knowing who made it. Louisa sat on the attic floor holding the small green dress. This proof was not needed. It changed nothing about the stolen money. Yet, it revealed the reach of Elias's silence. He had not merely kept 2 sisters apart. He had taken Anna's acts of love, stripped them of origin, and let them enter the family under his name. Florence asked if Louisa hated him now. Louisa looked at the doll's painted face. She said she hated what he had done. Some mornings, she hated him. Other mornings, she remembered the man who sat beside her through Harriet's final illness and could not make that man disappear. The difficulty was not a failure to judge. It was the cost of judging someone one had loved truly and known incompletely. They wrapped the doll in tissue. Louisa mailed it to Ruth with no explanatory letter, only a card. Made by Anna Venn for you, hidden by Elias, found at last. Ruth's answer came 10 days later. Grace had named the doll Annie. Ruth wrote that one arm was being repaired and that the green dress would remain exactly as Anna made it. At the bottom of the page, she invited Louisa to visit in August for Grace's 7th birthday. Louisa placed a letter beside Anna's cylinder. Then she opened Jacob's wooden case. Recording a voice was more awkward than playing one. The attachment replaced the ordinary reproducer. A small cutting stylus rested against the blank wax. The speaker had to stand close to the horn, speak firmly, and trust the groove to hold what air would otherwise lose. Florence read Jacob's penciled instructions. Louisa wound the spring. Then she stood before the horn and discovered that truth addressed to no visible face could still make a coward of her. Her first attempt began with Anna's name and dissolved into explanation. She stopped the machine. Jacob had included a little shaving device, but Florence warned that each shaving thinned the cylinder. Louisa asked her to shave it once. On the second attempt, Louisa spoke as if giving a newspaper correction. Dates, facts, and names marched into the horn. She stopped before the end. Florence did not criticize. She asked whether Louisa wished Anna to hear a report or her sister. The cylinder was shaved again. On the third attempt, Louisa did not prepare. She said Anna's name. She said she had not known Elias took the money. She should have believed Anna's denial even without another name to blame. She had allowed Harriet's certainty, Elias's fear, and her own pride to become more important than the sister who had slept beside her after the baby died. She said she had read every returned letter. She said Ruth still slept with one hand beside her face when tired. Marian had Anna's eyes, but a life that belonged to herself. Florence was going to become a nurse. Grace had named the doll Annie. Then Louisa said the words she had once considered too small for an injury so large. I am sorry. I love you. I was wrong. She did not ask Anna to forgive her. At the end, Louisa said she would no longer confuse silence with dignity. Florence lifted the stylus. The cylinder contained less than 2 minutes.
26 years had not made the necessary words longer. They played it once to ensure the groove had taken.
Louisa's recorded voice sounded thinner and older than the one she heard inside her head. It also sounded like Harriet in places. Louisa nearly asked Florence to shave it again. She did not. A truthful voice did not need to be flattering. The recording went to Cincinnati in the wooden case. Marian wrote that she listened alone in the sewing classroom. She placed Louisa's cylinder beside Anna's, not because she believed the two objects settled the past, but because questions and answers should be allowed to occupy the same shelf. She also corrected Louisa's proposed name for the permanent room. In her letter accompanying the bank draft, Louisa had proposed Annabelle Memorial Sewing Room. Marian returned the wording. Her mother had lived nearly all her adult life as Anna Venn. The Bell name was part of her, but it was not the family that fed her when she arrived in Cincinnati, waited outside while Marian was born, or sat beside her bed through pneumonia.
Jacob's name would not be erased in the act of restoring Harriet's. The room opened in October as the Anna Venn workroom. Louisa attended without speaking publicly. She sat in the second row while Marian thanked the donors and described the classes. There was no portrait draped in flowers, no sermon on sisterly love, and no reporter inside. Anna's old cutting table stood near the window. The 3 Millbrook machines had been fitted with new belts. Women began using the room the following morning. After the small ceremony, Marian took Louisa upstairs. They listened to both cylinders once. Anna asked whether Louisa knew. Louisa answered that she did not. Between the recordings lay a gap of 2 years and a death no machine could bridge. Hearing them together did not create a conversation. It made the absence clearer. Louisa cried then. She had cried at funerals, during illness, and once in Elias's arms after a physician said she would bear no more children.
Those tears had come with permission. In the workroom, she bent over Anna's scarred table and cried without arranging her face. Marian stood beside her. She did not say Anna had forgiven her. She did not say everything happened for a reason. She laid one hand between Louisa's shoulders and remained there until the grief became quiet enough to carry. Before Louisa returned to Millbrook, Marian gave her a button basket from Anna's table. It held horn buttons, pearl buttons, bone buttons, and bright glass ones, saved from dresses no longer remembered. Louisa protested that the basket belonged in the workroom. Marian said Anna had possessed several. Dressmakers trusted abundance in buttons. Louisa took it home. The millinery shop survived. It did not return to exactly what it had been. Mrs. Harcourt never collected the unfinished hat. Louisa removed its silk and used the frame for a schoolteacher who paid in 3 installments. Several old customers stayed away permanently. New ones came from the Shirtwaist Works, the Italian Parish, and Tuesday's cutting table. They bought less expensive hats and expected to be addressed with the same attention as bank directors' wives. Louisa discovered that respect became more accurate when it was not priced by the yard. Elsie's hours returned by winter. In spring, she asked for wages rather than an apprentice allowance. Louisa's first thought was that gratitude should make the girl patient. Her second thought recognized Harriet. Louisa reviewed the week's receipts with Elsie, showed her what the shop could afford, and negotiated. The act was ordinary. That was how change most often appeared after the speeches ended. Florence entered the Lakeside Training School in September. She cut her hair shorter, packed 2 plain blue dresses, and cried only when she found Anna's button basket inside her trunk with a note from Louisa. For repairs no uniform can predict.
Edwin drove her to the station. He had spent the summer arguing with his parents, then stopped reporting the arguments as evidence of love. He found work at a Cleveland bank instead of waiting for a position beneath his father. Whether he and Florence would marry remained undecided. Florence said a future that could not survive uncertainty was not yet a future worth promising. Louisa missed her terribly. She did not ask her to come home. Ruth's invitation for Grace's birthday remained valid. Louisa went to Cleveland in August and stayed at a boarding house 2 streets away, though Ruth offered the parlor sofa. She wanted closeness that did not immediately require Ruth to surrender space. Grace's cake leaned to one side. Lucia Moretti baked it, Ruth iced it, and Grace supplied sugar violets until no knife could enter without crushing one. Samuel gave his daughter a box of drawing pencils.
Louisa brought a child's hat with a blue ribbon and no feathers, because Grace had written that feathers made her sneeze. The pearl brooch appeared on Ruth's collar. Louisa looked at it but did not comment. After supper, Ruth showed her Anna's doll. The arm had been repaired. Grace had made a cardboard bed for it beneath her own. She knew the simple version of the story. Great-Aunt Anna made the doll, someone hid her name, and now the name had been found. The rest would wait until she could understand that adults might love and betray one another in the same lifetime. Louisa did not tell Grace that families should have no secrets. Children deserved privacy, surprise, and stories given at the right age. The danger was not secrecy itself. It was using silence to protect the powerful, and then calling the silence peace. On the final morning of the visit, Ruth walked Louisa to the streetcar. They had not recovered 8 years. They never would. Ruth still stiffened when Louisa offered advice without being asked. Louisa still mistook disagreement for distance. Once, over Grace's schooling, they quarreled so sharply that Samuel took the child around the block. The difference came afterward. Louisa did not leave for Millbrook early. Ruth did not retreat behind polite letters. They sat at the kitchen table and continued until each could repeat what the other meant without turning it into an insult. At the streetcar stop, Ruth asked whether Louisa was coming for Christmas. Louisa said she would be glad to come if Lucia did not mind. Ruth smiled. She said Lucia would mind a little and invite her anyway. That was more honest than harmony. Minerva Cole died the following January. 2 weeks before her death, Louisa carried the phonograph to the house near the canal. The machine was heavy, and the cab driver complained about the horn. Minerva sat beneath the same window with 2 blankets over her knees. She listened to Anna's cylinder with her blind face turned toward the sound. When the voice ended, Minerva asked Louisa to tell Marion that the minister's wife who watched Anna bleed in the sewing room had finally admitted she was afraid. She wanted no softer sentence. Louisa promised. This time, the promise was delivered while the woman who made it was alive. Marion answered before Minerva died. Louisa read the reply aloud at the bedside. Marion did not offer pardon, but she thanked Minerva for naming fear without dressing it as duty. Minerva asked to hear Anna once more. Louisa played the cylinder, then packed it carefully. Wax wore down each time a needle traveled the groove. A preserved voice could also be loved into silence. After that, the cylinders were played rarely. Anna's remained in Cincinnati beside Louisa's answer. Marion stored both in cotton, away from heat. She wrote the contents on the outside of each box, so no curious person would mistake them for entertainment. Once a year, she and Louisa listened together. Some years the visit occurred in Cincinnati. Some years, Marion came to Millbrook. The living did not wait a year to speak. Letters traveled each week between Millbrook, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. Not every letter concerned the past. Most did not. They contained the price of velvet, Grace's spelling marks, Florence's complaints about night duty, a joke Samuel heard at the printing works, and Marion's requests for coat patterns. The ordinariness of the correspondence became its own repair. In the spring of 1909, Ruth brought Grace to Mercer House for the first time. The child ran through rooms that had once been used to exclude her mother. She found Harriet's cash box on a shelf in Elias's study and asked why an empty box deserved so much space. Louisa told her it was there to remind the family that an object could hold nothing and still be used to imprison someone. Grace considered this too solemn and asked if she might keep buttons in it. Louisa gave her Anna's basket instead. On Sunday afternoon, they took Jacob's recording attachment from its case. Grace wanted to hear her own voice. Ruth hesitated. Louisa understood the fear. The machine had become associated with deathbed words, hidden truths, and women speaking after no one could interrupt them. Marion, who had come from Cincinnati for the visit, fitted a fresh blank cylinder to the mandrel. Grace stood on a footstool before the horn. She announced her full name, Grace Louisa Mercer, then recited a poem about a robin. Halfway through, she forgot a line, laughed, and called to her mother for help. Ruth supplied the word. Samuel, standing behind them, sneezed. Florence, home from training, told him he had ruined the recording. Everyone spoke at once.
The wax caught all of it. When they played it back, Grace's laughter burst from the horn first, followed by Ruth's prompt, Samuel's sneeze, Florence's protest, and Marion laughing in the background. Louisa's own voice could be heard at the end, not giving instruction, only laughing with them. Grace demanded they play it again. Louisa allowed one more turn. Then she lifted the needle gently. The cylinder went into a plain box. Grace wrote the label herself, making the G too large and the final letters climb uphill. No one marked it secret. No one wrote that it should be delivered after a death. It held no confession, no accusation, and no proof. It held a family answering one another before the room went quiet.